Everyone, thank you all for joining us. Very excited for a conversation today with Anna from Vana, talking about decentralized data, model ownership, and the future of decentralized AI. My name is Danny Starsuk. I'm a partner at Archetype. We're a early stage New York-based crypto VC where we focus a significant portion of our time on the future of AI. Anna, before we dive in, would you like to give a quick introduction to yourself and what you're building with Vana?
Yeah, I'm Anna, co-founder and CEO of Open Data Labs, which is the research and development company that originally created Vana. With Vana, we're building ways for users to pool their data to create AI that is collectively owned. Um, Really focusing on that problem of private data. How do you verify it? How do you pull it together? And how do you make it accessible for AI training? Excited to dive in.
So let's get after it. Anna, let's start with an interesting first question. You've described data as the new oil in the AI race, yet most people can't monetize their personal data as individuals. Can you walk us through how Vana transforms this dynamic and why you believe we're at a pivotal moment for data ownership?
Yeah, so I think the phrase kind of data is the new oil is really kind of capturing this important thing that I think is often missed of like AI models are literally just a statistical representation of their training data, right? At the end of the day, an AI model is like literally just like take all the data and then you get these kind of model weights. And I think that it's really easy to kind of forget the fact that all of collective humanity has actually just helped teach all of the AI models that exist today, right? They're primarily trained on the public internet. Now that's kind of changing because we've run out of data from the public internet. It's around 15 trillion words, so we need somewhere to get more and more data. And what Vana's approach is it's really leveraging kind of individual data rights because each individual has full legal ownership of their data. You can go get your data from all these different platforms and allowing users to pool it together through different data DAOs. A bunch of different data DAOs on the network. There's like one that's focused on car data where you can join with your Tesla data. There's a Reddit one. There's a Twitter one, kind of across the board. There's some health focused ones. And basically having users pool their data and making it available for AI training. There are a lot of things to get right about having people kind of own their data, right? Like working with data in any sort of financialized context, like you need to think about how you preserve the economic value of the data, right? Like if I sell you my data, how do I know that you haven't kind of taken a copy of it and resold it? And so we have kind of this built-in, almost like programmable privacy where you can allow for a specific operation to be able to run on the data.
And on that line, as an early initiative, your Reddit data DAO achieved remarkable success with something like 140,000 users joining in the first week, and even forced Reddit to address that and change their data policies. What does this tell us about user appetite for data ownership, and how did the success validate your thesis early on?
Yeah, I think that the idea of data ownership has kind of been around in like crypto or even outside of crypto and more of like federated context, think like Urbit, Solid Project for a long time. Like the idea of wanting to own your data is not new. Actually, I think it's kind of the original premise of the internet was that users would own their own data and actually physically, like people thought people would physically carry a device on them that contained all of their data, which I think now we rely mostly on the cloud, et cetera. But that's how people thought it would play out early on. But I think that users are really not willing to sacrifice convenience, right? Convenience is really important. And users don't really use products for security, right? You're not like, oh, I'm going to use this new product because it's very secure. You use a new product because you're like, oh, what's the thing I could do that I couldn't do before? And so, in the context of Vana and the Reddit data DAO, what we saw is that when you give someone kind of ownership of something that they didn't even realize they had, right? Most people don't realize that they legally own all of their data. It's like this very 0 to 1 moment of like, oh, I didn't even realize I had this. And if you were a Reddit user with a lot of karma in kind of the very top 0.1%, et cetera, you could make like $300 or $400 for your data. Right. And so that's actually very meaningful. And what we saw is that a lot of the users were actually new to crypto and they actually set up a new wallet and kind of it was worth it for them to go and figure all of that out. The other thing I would say is that honestly, Reddit was just doing a lot of marketing essentially for in the sense of they were saying like because they were doing their IPO, people saw that they were earning like $200 million selling data just for AI training, right? That's all user data. And so I think that because of some of that, people had become a lot more aware of the fact that their data is really valuable. And I think this AI wave has made it a lot more kind of top of mind, like where's this data actually coming from? And really just putting a price on data ownership.
On that broader point around the importance of educating people on this idea, most people assume, platforms own their data, but I think you've argued that users are actually the legal owners, something like a car in a parking lot. Can you explain this legal framework and how Vana enables users to reclaim ownership of data that's currently generating billions for tech giants?
Yeah, so a lot of people think about the data that they produce on the internet as belonging to the platform, right? So you're like, oh, my Facebook posts are Facebook's because they're called Facebook posts, right? Or my Reddit posts are Reddit's, or even like Telegram messages, Eight Sleep data. But if you look at the law, all of your data is yours, right? In the same way that when you put your car in a parking lot, the parking lot doesn't like randomly start owning your car just because you parked it there. Like when you put your data in a platform, it's still entirely legally yours. You check the terms of service box, which gives them permission to use your data to do things like operate the service. One is I just think that predominantly big tech probably doesn't want you to know that, right? Because they have like a very good business model of you not knowing that. And then I think there's kind of been this shift that's been happening, a lot of it related to data regulation, right? So GDPR, CCPA, there's actually new legislation out of Utah, which is kind of, I'd say, like leading best in class, where it's the Digital Choice Act, where they require kind of full data interoperability. You can actually export your data and get API access to it. But even outside of Utah, you can pretty much always get your data within 30 days. And that includes all the data within a platform. So if you have like an Amazon Alexa, you can export every single audio recording they have for you on you for like a decade back. It's kind of a terrifying experience, right? Like across all of these different platforms. In some cases too, you can even get the AI labels that they've generated of you. So like Instagram, for example, you can generate not just your export, not just your posts and kind of your images. You can even see which AI labels they put on you for marketing purposes. And sometimes they're kind of offensive or interesting. So that's kind of a fun exercise as well. Yeah. And then in terms of kind of the legal framework that Vana operates around, I guess that if you think about kind of a centralized company, they don't necessarily have the right to go and get a user's data for them, right? The user as an individual has that right. So Vana is really designed to make the individual the data processor, right? In the same way that with Bitcoin, like Bitcoin isn't your bank, you are your own bank, right? Because you control your keys. In the case of Vana, like Vana is not acting as a data processor, like actually the individual user is being their own data processor, right? And we call it kind of non-custodial data in the same way that you can have non-custodial wallets that allow you to kind of be your own bank. With Vana, you really are kind of in control of all your data at a cryptographic level. And that actually becomes pretty important. Like there are cases, yeah, the Reddit data policy you brought up, like they had kind of gone out following the Reddit data DAO and said that Vana was violating kind of the terms of their API policy, but actually because every user has legal data rights, it was able to stay up, right? Because every user has the legal right to actually go and get their data. And I think that this is a good example of why decentralization is actually quite important, right? You can't really do this in a centralized way. It has to be each individual user having the right to do this on their own through a decentralized platform. So that's really what we've designed around.
It's really helpful. And I think you're playing a critical role in terms of educating and empowering the market and users to take back control. On that broader point, you've stated before that whoever decides what goes into AI is essentially deciding the truth, and that it can be scary to have a single or a small group of entities controlling this. And so to combat that, you've announced partnerships like the one with Flower Labs to build the world's first user-owned AI model. How did these collaborations, in combination with Vana's data DAOs, advance decentralized AI? And ultimately, what does shared model ownership actually look like in practice?
Yeah, so kind of thinking about the role that AI models play in society and kind of the risks of having that be centralized. I think there are kind of two ways to look at the risk. One is kind of through this lens of like truth, where like increasingly people get their information from AI. And there was an example maybe a year or two back now where Google Bard released something where if you asked it about a historically accurate picture of like a medieval prince, it would show you like an Indian woman, right? And people were like, oh, it's this crazy wokeness of the 2020s. But really, like, if there weren't another source of truth, people would just start believing that. Like, that would just become truth, right? And so whoever's deciding like that training data that goes in is basically deciding truth for that AI model and therefore deciding truth for society. So it's very important kind of from a truth and knowledge perspective. And then also economically, right? Like, I think OpenAI recently announced they're hitting like $10 billion in revenue. And that is a huge amount of economic concentration that comes from the fact that they have the best AI model because they've trained on a lot of data. And so with the work that we're doing with Flower AI and Collective One, which is the first kind of user-owned foundation model means that it's a model trained from scratch, so kind of full pre-training. I'll note too, like, if you ask someone 18 months ago, can you do full pre-training in a distributed way? People would have actually said no, right? So it's actually like a huge milestone that this is even possible. Flower was one of the first, I think, like 12 to 18 months ago, they trained the first 1 billion parameter model of full pre-training in a distributed way. Collective One is 7 billion parameters trained on data from all across the different data DAOs on Vana, text only data to start. But what it really creates is this path towards being able to create AI models that are owned by many people, right? So today, over 1 million users have contributed data to Vana across all the different data DAOs. One of our guiding kind of North Stars is getting to 100 million users, because that gets us to, we've estimated about 450 trillion tokens, to basically just a word. And that is a 30 times larger data set than any single AI company has, right? So our view is that being able to scale up this process and train better and better base models actually allows for an AI model that's collectively owned by everybody who's contributed data. And then you kind of end up with the best of both worlds, where I think right now a lot of people are scared of AI, right? And they're scared that it could take their jobs or that AI could automate them. But if you own the AI that you've helped to teach to do your job, then it's actually a good thing, right? And you can kind of have this win-win and really align incentives nicely. So yeah, that's with Collective One. Yeah, 7 billion parameter trained on text data from across the network.
It's incredibly exciting. And to your point, yeah, a year and a half, 2 years ago, people would have not thought this was possible. And it, I think, speaks to both innovations that are happening at the model training layer, but obviously critically, the stuff you and your team are doing at the data layer. You previously mentioned the data wall problem affecting AI development, where companies like OpenAI and others have exhausted public internet data. And this is increasingly a well understood problem. How does Vana's approach to aggregating private data solve this scarcity issue? What makes private data more valuable? And how do you ultimately compete with tech giants like Google and Meta and Amazon, who have massive data advantages and resources?
Yeah, so I think the data wall, just to sort of lay out what that problem is, it's really this idea that we're kind of running out of data to train AI on. And if you look at these kind of scaling laws, generally the approach that AI researchers have taken is, if you want to make better AI, then kind of scale things up from a training perspective. So add more compute, add more data. Maybe you can innovate on the market model architecture side so that you can scale that even faster. And as we've scaled up compute, we've actually started to run out of enough data to train on. So now kind of leading models trained on around 15 trillion tokens, which is the size of FineWeb. FineWeb is basically, if you take Common Crawl, which is a scrape of the whole public internet, and then you just take a high quality subset, remove duplicates, et cetera. One, it's like very impressive that we've trained AI on the whole public internet. Like, I think no human being has probably read the whole public internet. That's just a huge amount of information. But if we want to make better AI, we need somewhere to get more data. Something I'll mention too, the data wall is kind of both an issue of quantity. So that's kind of, you can measure that in tokens, 15 trillion tokens we've run out. I think it's also an issue of quality, where just the quality of data is extremely important. And I think that, like, DeepSeek is an example where they kind of overcame the data wall by starting with a really high quality, small amount of data. They actually hired a bunch of like math and computer science PhDs to just generate very, very high quality reasoning data. And then they used a synthetic data approach to scale that up. And so there's a lot of work in the synthetic data space right now, which is actually trying to scale up what's possible with the existing data that we have, right? But our view at Vana, so if you look at the whole public internet, it seems like so much, right? But it's actually a very small percent of the overall internet. It's kind of between like 0.1% to 4%. It's hard to get an exact estimate. You can also think about it as an individual user, like of the data you've generated today, how much of that is on the public internet? Probably not that much, right? For me, it's like, okay, I've been talking to chatbots, I've been writing in documents, like most of that is not in the public internet. And increasingly, a lot of it, yeah, is inside of these different walled gardens or even inside of the different AI companies that offer kind of tools of you interacting with AI. And so the approach that we're taking is really allowing for that data rather than it sitting inside of a walled garden where often it kind of gets stuck, isn't available for AI training, making that available by having the individual user export their data from each of these platforms, export your ChatGPT data, export your Telegram data, and making that available for AI training. Often a question is sort of like, okay, say you could get 1% of all Reddit users. Why would someone buy data from the Reddit data DAO instead of for Reddit, right? Because Reddit necessarily has 100% of the data. And I think often implicit in that question, people are assuming that Reddit can do whatever they want with your data, right? Or Facebook can do whatever they want with your data. And that's actually not the case. Like there are cases where because of the terms of service and also because I honestly just like PR backlash if they were literally training on your private messages without like I think there would be some level of pushback. And so there's actually a lot of data sitting inside of big tech companies that they themselves can't even train on. My co-founder used to work in data sales, selling data to big tech companies, and there were cases where a big tech company was actually have it like buying data of a messaging platform that they operate, right? But they can't actually access and legally train on that. So it's kind of these weird cases. The other thing I'd mention is the importance of cross-platform data. So say you want to buy, if you were buying Spotify data on the open data collection market, which is just like a very niche industry, but anyway, well, so that would cost you like around 30 cents. But if you're buying data on like you need users Spotify data and their fashion data and their demographic data, that would be like $25. And that's from like a Fortune 500 company that buys this data through Vana. And so what you notice there is that the data is like 100 times more valuable because it's this cross-platform data, right? Spotify can't sell Spotify and fashion data. They don't have fashion data, right? And so you actually have this like really unique power of a user to be able to kind of have this cross-platform data and build a better data set that you can get like anywhere else. And I think what's cool about that from an AI perspective, and one of the reasons that I got into kind of because I was into like decentralization and then I was training different AI models and I saw that a lot of my friends who were like doing great AI stuff were just going to go work at big tech companies because that's where the data was. And often the data sets that I wanted, like I couldn't even get, like even within a given company, like you couldn't get the cross-platform stuff. So yeah, that's kind of one of the unique things that's enabled through having this like user-owned data.
The point around just how much data sits behind closed walls is really remarkable. And I don't think it's necessarily intuitive to people. People think most of it's out in the open web. And, you know, the initial reaction to hitting those data walls was like, well, we'll just move into different modalities. We'll scrape video data and we'll go into audio and things like that, where you're making the really relevant point that like actually there's an incredible universe of data that sits behind walled gardens and is represented by people's sovereign private data. And I think it's an incredibly interesting insight. I'm curious how you think about the need for post-processing work from Vana's side. Obviously, there's the increasing rumors around what Meta is now doing with Scale AI. Clearly, data is becoming the core battleground amongst these companies. And you're right to call out, it's not just about quantity of data, it's about quality of data as well. Is your view that there's just so much untapped data in those walled gardens, in the private repos of everyday users, that just unlocking that supply side is enough early on? Or are you also opinionated thinking towards how do we do things like, you know, the post-processing of data and really refining the quality as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's very important that the data is of high quality, right? And so if you don't have any sort of quality check and you're just like dealing with random dumps of data, that's very hard to work with. I will say that AI researchers are like surprisingly patient. Like if they can whittle it down to like 1 to 5% good data, that's actually fine as long as they can get to that. So there are kind of two layers this happens in within Vana. The first is through proof of contribution. So when a user is contributing data to a data DAO, there's a quality check that runs on that that's kind of scoring it. And it can receive a score of 0 if it's kind of like full on rejected, or it can receive a score based on kind of how much it's actually adding to the data set overall. And that can check things like, oh, is this account sufficiently old? Does it contain enough data? Sometimes there's an LLM that's even checking the quality of the data. But then there's also, okay, and then as you're adding it in, there's also this refinements piece of Vana. So if there are developers who built like a data DAO on Vana, you've probably seen this refinements piece. Basically, what it's doing is after the proof of contribution check, which is checking quality, it's actually structuring the data in a SQL format. If you have video or audio data, then that is just like a link to that. But the SQL query basically allows you to granularly grant access to the data and communicate what the structure and shape of the data is. So that's kind of how it works today. But then there's sometimes work on top of that. So this is like a little bit more technical on the AI side, but I mentioned earlier you have Common Crawl, kind of this massive scrape of the whole public internet. But most people don't train on Common Crawl, they train on Fine Web. And so Fine Web is kind of a cleaned version of Common Crawl. And there's also kind of like some, I don't know what the right word, it's kind of like this massaging that happens where you're like trying to make sure that you're properly representing different parts of the data. And what we're seeing today, we're actually seeing this with like training Collective One and kind of with other AI models, is that there's kind of this whole new work related to post-processing when you're working with private user-owned data that you have to do, right? Where you're trying to figure out how do you properly like represent the right demographics, who is undersampled, who is oversampled, and all of that work. And so I actually think there's a ton of like new research related to this. Colin Raffel at the Vector Institute is a professor who has been doing a lot of cool research related to this. So I think there's a lot going on within academia trying to sort this out. We see it kind of Vana at the protocol level. Our job is to really enable this infrastructure so that data can be programmable, so that you can have these different kind of refinements and post-processing. But that's an area where I'm seeing a lot of interesting work coming out.
It's a really, really helpful overview, and it's clear just how thoughtful and remarkably technically competent I think you and your team have been in this approach. So it's fascinating to hear about that. You mentioned briefly about how proof of contribution works, but obviously the technical stack that you've re-architected from the ground up is an incredibly complex ecosystem. Today, Vana operates as an EVM compatible layer one blockchain with something like 16 independent data DAOs operational. Why did you choose to build dedicated infrastructure rather than using, existing blockchains and stacks that you could have pulled off the shelf?
Yeah. So one of the interesting things about Vana is that we're really designed to work with like private user owned data. And there are actually a lot of regulatory constraints that come with that too, right? So often a trade-off that many teams make today is to like make the trade-off of, okay, let's get better performance in exchange for centralization, right? So for example, in L2, much better performance, but much more centralized. You have kind of a centralized sequencer. Um, we actually can't make those trade-offs in the context of Vana because if you have that centralization, then that would actually get regulated as like a data processor under GDPR. And then that would require giving users like the right to delete specific records that live on the chain, right? And that is, I guess, very hard to do in a blockchain context, right? And that's one specific example, right? But like basically when you're trying to modify blockchains, which are really more designed for like public financial transactions, and instead use it to essentially store this like global state of permissions around private data. There are a variety of modifications where you're like, okay, I need this to be sufficiently decentralized. I need this to be optimized for private data. But you can borrow a lot from, I think, what Ethereum has really pioneered, right? So fully EVM compatible. We have the VRC20 token standard, which is basically a standard for data tokens. And then there's another set of validators, kind of data validators in the network, which operate on these trusted execution environments. And that's actually where the operations on private data happen. So we kind of have this like dual validator system where you have what looks like kind of a traditional L1 validator in an EVM context, and then a data validator, which is running the operations based on the permissions that are set out on chain.
Got it. And so that's, I think, ties into how you all think about the importance of ensuring user privacy while still, enabling training and sort of different operational processes on top of private data. How do you think about the need to keep user data private post training and sort of like when these models are actually being deployed? I mean, is it more just as soon as it's been used to kind of deploy and train the model, backtracking to an individual's model's piece of data is incredibly difficult, or are there deeper complexities and layers that you all have built into it?
Yeah, so I guess on the data privacy side, I think just maybe one fundamental question is like, why is it important to keep data private? Like, what is the ultimate goal you're trying to achieve? And I think it's kind of twofold. One is like, as a user, I guess I don't want some of my data to be public, right? Like if I add my messages, I just like don't want those to be public. And the other is more economic, actually, right? Which is basically like if you make something public, it becomes very hard to charge money for it, right? And so all the data DAOs kind of focus on private data. Our view is kind of if the data is publicly available, it kind of has like somewhat limited, there's just a ceiling to how much we can make sure that a user gets paid for it. Um, and then from a training perspective, so like honestly, it kind of depends on the model and the architecture. Like there's a certain, and maybe, yeah, there's like a certain class, I think it's a 3D model where people have proven that you can like exactly reverse engineer the data just from the model weights, right? And so it's not
Mm.
necessarily the case that if you're training an AI model and then you take those weights, you still need to make sure that you can't reverse engineer the data from those weights. And so the way it operates right now on Vana is that the data DAOs actually have to approve the code that runs on their data, right? And so it actually today is like somewhat manual of people going and inspecting, and I think provide like us helping to provide guidance in the ecosystem of like, okay, yeah, we think this is privacy preserving or not, but it's actually quite manual right now. I think over time it will get kind of more and more. Automatic in terms of how to evaluate that. And there are different techniques, like you can have kind of differential privacy and stuff like there are techniques, but often the problem is that some of those techniques really trade off against performance. And in this AI race right now, like you can't necessarily take a 100x performance hit. Otherwise, your model is going to be like, I don't know, like Llama 2, like it's just going to be like so far behind. And so, what you need is an environment where you actually can be performant at the frontier and still get the privacy guarantees needed.
That's helpful. It's always interesting how much consideration you all are putting into giving participants in the ecosystem autonomy and decision-making choice in the different aspects of the network. And it brings to mind an interesting question, which is how do you think about the trade-off and the value proposition to your users between profit and ownership and perhaps ideology? And what I mean by that is, your work with different decentralized model training companies is fantastic because, to your point, they're training things from the ground up where users have ownership and they can have more governance, right? But there might be a scenario where some of the leading model companies recognize the incredible work that you're doing in unlocking this crucial new source of data and offer a much more attractive profit sharing agreement and sort of business arrangement. Have you thought about the possibility and sort of that side of the equation where people might want to also sell into the for-profit centralized model companies?
Yeah, and I think too, like right now, like the Tesla, the car data DAO, for example, they sell to just like normal car battery companies. It's not like there's kind of no, I because I think that it's actually quite important to be pretty tactical from a commercial perspective, right? Like at the end of the day, if a user isn't actually getting anything for their data, like then you kind of fit, like they're not really owning their data, right? So that driving that commercial piece is really important. That said, there are trade-offs, right? So if you're kind of trying to build this self-sovereign AI, but then all of the data just gets sold to centralized companies, that's kind of this hard trade-off to consider. To date, what we found, like, so one of the models that was trained on the Reddit data was trained by like an ex Google Brain ML engineer who kind of just wanted to train like, he kind of did some, yeah, he trained a leading shit posting model, which I think is kind of, it understands humor. It's just trained on Reddit data. But I actually think that, so right, if you look at the landscape right now, so compared to 2 years, like 2 years ago, really the only model training getting done was in like frontier labs. And I think that started to shift a little bit. There's actually, I think, somewhat of a big community that emerged around when Stable Diffusion came out, around like fine-tuning models. But and then now we have this whole new kind of role, which is almost like this AI entrepreneur or like data entrepreneur. And in the long run, like kind of over like a 3 to 5 to 10 year time horizon, I think that the majority of the kind of activity on the network will come from AI models that are trained in this decentralized way and that actually are owned by these kind of new developers who usually wouldn't be able to buy data or compute in the way that they need to compete at the frontier, but because they can do it in a user-owned way where they're giving the users ownership of the AI model in exchange for their data, um, yeah, it sort of unlocks these new possibilities. But I think it is important to just kind of be tactical, ensure that kind of over a short kind of 1 to 2 year time horizon, there are kind of meaningful opportunities. And I think another aspect of decentralization is like, so the team of people who build data DAOs on Vana full time is actually bigger than Open Data Labs plus the Vana Foundation, which are kind of two of the entities who are contributing to Vana. And a lot of them, like we just kicked off Vana Academy last week, which is a program to teach people about how to build different data businesses, get them up to speed on all things Vana and use their own data. And there was someone there who was like a quantum researcher, and they were telling me, they're like, I'm going to start a quantum data DAO. Like, this is the exact data that's needed for quantum research. And I was like, wow, I have like no idea what any of this quantum data stuff means, right? But what we've set up is a way for somebody to be able to bring that expertise in, right? And in the same way, the guy who's running DLP Labs, which is the car data DAO, like great enterprise sales guy, like so good at selling data, right? And so kind of creating this environment where people can bring those different skill sets in and pair it with the infrastructure to kind of broadly advance self-sovereign data.
Makes a ton of sense. And it's incredibly exciting to hear about how dynamic and diverse and interesting the ecosystem of contributors and DAOs has become atop the network in the earliest days. Switching gears a little bit here, following some of the major funding that I think you all have received from groups like Paradigm and Coinbase Ventures, the Vana token is now live, having launched through Binance and is now trading very actively. How do Vana's tokenomics incentivize data contribution, and what role does the token ultimately play in the governance of these decentralized data cooperatives?
Yeah, so Vana kind of has this like dual token system where you have the Vana native token, and then you have like these data set specific tokens following the VRC20 standard. So kind of similar to how Ethereum has kind of ETH, the native asset, and then different ERC20 tokens on top. Vana has basically like Vana as a native asset, and then all of these different data tokens. Um, to incentivize data coming into the network for kind of the top DLPs who meet kind of the different protocol standards set out. DLPs, which is kind of a more technical term for data DAO, they can basically earn for onboarding data into the network that's useful. Useful is measured through metrics like how much is the data actually being accessed and kind of being earned, and then how many people are contributing to the data set. And then that reward goes to buying their data token and then is paired with Vana and put into a DEX to ensure that there's kind of liquidity on that data token. And really what the goal of these data tokens is to do is like tokenize data as this asset class, right? Increasingly, a lot of companies, like really so much of their like value and importance comes from their data set, right? How much of Tesla's market cap comes from the fact that they have all of these Teslas collecting data all over, right? And what would it look like if you could actually trade the data set separately from the company entity, right? And so we think that increasingly this like data as an asset is this really important primitive in this AI native world for people to be able to build different financial products, whether it's being able to just take out a loan against your data, right? Data really as collateral, or being able to kind of earn like passive yield on top of that data. And then, yeah, so Vana kind of as an L1, kind of traditional transaction fees both for like any sort of trade of like a data token and for any compute that kind of runs on the network. And then there's also built into the data access layer. So when you're buying data, 80% of that happens in the data token, and then 20% of that happens in Vana, and that's all burned. The data DAOs right now are kind of doing that migration this quarter. Something I'll note too is that a lot of companies have no idea what a data DAO is or why cryptocurrency could have something to do with them needing to get data. And so there's a company called TensorSource, which kind of helps to abstract a lot of that away for more of like a Web2 data buyer. So they can just think, okay, I pay in USD and then I get this data. And TensorSource kind of deals with a lot of that abstraction.
It's a very, very elegant system. I think it's really well thought out, where you've given the participants and the DAOs themselves the flexibility to create their own economic model that adapt to the types of data, the types of channels, and the user bases that they're working with and selling into, while still maintaining, I think, a cohesive whole that's centered on the Vana, L1 and ultimately, your base network. So I think a lot of credit is due there, and it was really well thought out. Your goal, you mentioned earlier, to onboard 100 million users and aggregate the world's largest trading data set is an incredibly ambitious and exciting challenge, but also outcome. What's the general roadmap to achieve this? And maybe more importantly, what are some of the major obstacles that you anticipate as we make progress on that roadmap?
Yeah, I mean, the most obvious thing is like we don't even have 100 million crypto users right now, right? Like real, right? There actually aren't even 100 million users in crypto, probably of like daily crypto projects truly on chain. And so, like one thing is like that probably means that we're going to do a lot of that onboarding to crypto just as Vana, and someone's first experience of crypto is going to be contributing their data to a data DAO, right? And that's also a good way for them to get on board, right? Because they don't necessarily have to start with capital. Their data is actually their capital to come in. um, I think that there are actually a lot of product details that are like really important to getting right to bringing on kind of a large scale user base. Like the success, so the car one has around 10,000 users. The Reddit Data DAO is one of the largest ones with several hundred thousand users. And I think what those have done really well is actually just built a great consumer product that is inherently viral, right? And that is a high quality product where when the marginal user uses it, they tell like strictly then greater, like more than one person about it. And then it just kind of grows exponentially. So I think that a lot of it is actually just really just building good consumer product experiences, which can be hard in crypto today, right? Because you have a wallet that you need to set up, et cetera. And so we're trying to make that easier and easier, kind of abstracted away more and more. How can you have gasless transactions? How can you hide some of the wallet components while still keeping users in full control? So yeah, those are some of the things I would mention. The other thing I'd mention is kind of the regulatory piece. And there are kind of two kinds of regulation. We have to think about both crypto regulation and data regulation. Especially on the data regulation side, I think that has actually mostly been a tailwind that has been quite helpful as regulation has gotten better and better. But I mean, if you just look at Vana, it does kind of threaten some of the business models of some of the big tech companies today, right? And so I think that that is a headwind that we just kind of have to expect in the long run. And then, I mean, the other thing that I actually think is constraining crypto generally, but kind of we experience day to day is like really bringing great builders in, right? And I think that a lot of people, they might perceive crypto as like just NFTs and meme coins, right? But like crypto is so much more. It's like a new way of building like technology in a way that's kind of fully self-sovereign and kind of unlocks all these different kinds of things that you just couldn't build in a centralized context. I think self-sovereignty is kind of the really interesting property there. And then this kind of programmable composability. So I think that inviting new talent in to really drive forward. I mean, we're just so early in terms of crypto adoption. Like, I feel like that it's kind of, we'll look back on it in like 10 years and be like, wow, they were like, I can't believe that worked, of like just the stage of crypto in the industry today. Yeah, so I'd say like those are some of the main things. It's kind of like on the just pure data contributor side, how do you get to 100 million? How do you build great consumer products that bring people in? Some kind of headwinds related to, yeah, if you kind of are challenging a business model that is working very well right now within big tech, obviously that could create some headwinds. And then kind of thinking about like how do you bring in the best builders, right? And that's part of what we're doing with Vana Academy, really getting people up to speed on kind of what's a wallet, what does it mean to build data DAO, and kind of going through that and bringing in really a commercial lens too of like how do you make sure you collect a valuable data set that you can actually sell. And I think sometimes that can be missing to some extent in crypto today.
I think the market commentary is spot on, and you're clearly well apprised of the different challenges and opportunities that are ahead. So we're all excited for the next few months and years for Vana. Speaking of, you've shared your wish list, I think, previously of data DAOs that you'd like to see. You obviously have an incredibly diverse ecosystem already building atop Vana across different use cases and channels and technologies. What types of data cooperatives are you most excited to see emerge in the coming months and years, and how might those reshape entire industries?
Yeah, a couple categories I'm really excited about right now. I think robotics, healthcare, and bio. So bio, kind of research, et cetera. So with robotics, so much of robotics just in Web 2 across the board is constrained by data. Like I was talking to someone who has a robotics company and they actually bought a cleaning company so they could make the cleaners wear video cameras to get training data. Right. Like that is crazy. Right. And so like I think that robotics is like very constrained on the data side. And there are a couple of interesting projects kind of working towards this on Vana. The healthcare space, so much of healthcare is extremely regulated. It's really hard to get the training data that you need, and that's very constraining. So I think there's a huge amount of opportunity there from like longevity biohacking stuff to actually like training kind of better models for personalized medicine, et cetera. And then on the bio side, I think that this is kind of earlier. Like it's earlier stage, kind of more conceptual, I'd say, actually, just across the industry. But I think that there's so much scientific progress that's going to get discovered by AIs, right? Like AIs are actually going to be doing so much scientific progress. And a lot of the information to help them do that scientific progress needs to be collected from the real world, whether it is like a researcher contributing their notes and stuff of how they actually figured something out, and also what didn't work, right? Not just the papers that were published, but the papers that weren't published. And then also having like good flywheels of actually getting ground truth data. I was talking to like a bio ML researcher who was telling me like they couldn't train on just bio publications because actually a lot of bio publications are wrong and have like incorrect information. So they need better ground truth data, right? So that's kind of this interesting thing of like, okay, where do you actually get that data? Where does it come from? And then the other thing is like, I mean, we're still not at 450 trillion tokens of text from 100 million users, right? So actually just some straight up like main social media data DAO or kind of any text-based data source, Google Docs, email, Twitch, Discord, a lot of those actually aren't created yet. And so I think there's a ton of opportunity there too, that I'm excited about.
Those are all really, really cool frontiers. And I think it leads to the inevitable next question, which is for our audience of builders and investors, what opportunities do you see in the data DAO ecosystem? How can people get involved? What should they know about, particularly the accelerator program that you're running? And what's next for Vana beyond that in terms of product launches, partnerships, or milestones that you'd like to share with the Redefined Tomorrow audience?
Yeah, so I think that if you are a builder, like one, just what an amazing time to be alive because of what's going on in AI and crypto, like it's the frontier. Like it is this crazy moment. Like I just like so just kind of embracing the fact that everything is moving so quickly and we're at the beginning of this exponential, right, as an industry. And so I think what I would really encourage builders to do is like one, be willing to take kind of like this asymmetric bet of like actually have an opinionated view on like, hey, this is a data source I think is going to be really important, or this is a part of the stack that I think is going to be really important. Um, Tactically, I think like starting a data DAO, whether you already have kind of a project that has some aspect of users contributing data, or you're starting something from scratch. If you want to get ideas, there's like, yeah, I wrote a wish list for the holidays of data DAOs I'd want to see in 2025. That's like an interesting starting point if you want to check that out. The other thing is if you're coming from an AI perspective and you just want to train better AI models, like your dream data set might be available on Vana today, right? So being able to access this next level data is really a differentiator, right? So many of the AI companies today, what they're kind of thinking is like, how do I get data that somebody else doesn't have, right? Like the video companies, they're kind of like, okay, what do we think they're collecting? And then like, how do I get what they don't have, right? So someone was asking us for FaceTime recordings and we were like, we don't know if we can get you that right now, right? But like, that's kind of like, yeah, so there might be a data set that actually gives you like this huge edge as a model builder. Um, then the other thing is if you're coming more from a financial context, you can build really interesting kind of DeFi applications on top of data as an asset class, right? You can build a lending protocol where data is the collateral. So I think that's this really interesting frontier. But yeah, if you want to get involved, Vana Academy is kind of a great program, so you can apply to the next batch of that. We also have kind of a builder only Discord if you want to kind of dive deep in there. And then I think that there are, yeah, if you want to join like an early stage team building on Vana in some way, whether it's a data DAO or someone training frontier models, there's a huge amount of opportunity, right? And so I think just coming in general within this kind of decentralized AI space, there is just an abundance of like greenfield space to play, right? Like you could even build kind of this, some people doing like encrypted vector embeddings across all the different data DAOs, right? Like kind of when you have this totally new data stack of like, how do you work with data? Okay, here's a totally new way of interacting with it. There's just a huge amount of opportunity. So yeah, I think just kind of like, yeah, diving in is a good way to start, whether it's Vana Academy or in the docs. You can just launch a data DAO fully permissionlessly. I used to know everyone building a data DAO. Now I don't, but that's really cool because I like look on mainnet and I'm like, oh wow, someone's like,
Awesome. Anna, thank you so much. There's so many incredibly exciting ways to get involved. Gets me excited. I'm sure the audience will be as well. Thank you for your time today. And yeah, wishing you the best of the rest of your afternoon.
yeah, thanks so much for hosting.